and post-war interviews and staff studies conducted with surviving German commanders repeatedly returned to this theme, with more than one officer recalling, in later testimony gathered by Allied historical teams, a sense of operating half-blind in terrain their own planning documents had led them to expect would be far more accommodating than it was. It is in this context that the sentiment behind the framing of this video, that American mapping felt almost unfairly good by comparison, recurs across post-war German accounts, even if no single tidy quotation survives in the historical record to be pinned to one officer and one moment. What does survive is a consistent thread of frustration, expressed by several commanders in interviews and memoirs at having been sent to fight in terrain their own intelligence had not truly shown them. Set against Allied practice elsewhere in the war, the American effort in the Ardennes was not even the most extreme example of what Western Allied topographic organization could achieve, but it illustrates a broader pattern. British survey and mapping organizations had, since the desert campaigns of North Africa, developed similarly sophisticated systems of aerial photographic interpretation feeding rapid map revision, and the two allies shared methods, personnel training, and in some cases printing capacity as the European campaign progressed. German mapping was not universally poor. German cartographic institutions had produced excellent work earlier in the war, when time, resource, and reconnaissance access allowed it, and German artillery survey techniques in particular retained a well-earned reputation for precision throughout the conflict. What changed by the winter of 1944 was context rather than competence. Germany's mapping arms were being asked to support a major offensive under compressed timelines with reconnaissance aircraft that could not safely fly the routes needed, drawing on base data that had not been meaningfully refreshed in years, while the country's broader industrial and logistical base buckled under the strain of fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Americans, fighting from a position of growing material abundance and unchallenged control of the air over the battle area, could afford to build and sustain an intelligence infrastructure that treated an up-to-date map as a routine expectation rather than a luxury. It is a comparison less of cleverness than of circumstance, though the circumstance itself was not accidental. It had been built deliberately over years of doctrine and organization. The legacy of this episode is easy to understate because maps, unlike tanks or aircraft, rarely survive in public memory as objects of drama. Yet, the lesson that Allied topographic and engineering communities drew from the Ardennes and from the wider European campaign fed directly into Cold War-era developments in battlefield terrain intelligence, aerial and later satellite photographic interpretation, and the grid reference systems that underpin military mapping to this day. Surviving examples of the actual map sheets used by American units in December 1944 can still be found in archival collections, including the holdings of the U.S. Army Center of Military History and the National Archives, precise, spare documents that give little outward hint of how much they mattered to the men who carried them folded in map cases through the Ardennes snow. The psychological dimension deserves acknowledgement, too. For German officers already contending with fuel shortages, air attack, and an enemy who seemed to have solved logistical problems the Wehrmacht itself could not, discovering that the enemy also appeared to know the ground better than they did was one more accumulation of disadvantage in a battle that had begun with high hopes and ended, 6 weeks later, in one of the costliest defeats the German army suffered in the West. Return, for a moment, to that folding table in the Eifel, the shaded lamp, the map with its pre-war contour lines. The officer bent over it that December night was not lacking in skill, courage, or resolve. He was lacking in information, and information in modern warfare is a weapon every bit as real as a tank or a shell. 100 kilometers to the west, another officer bent over another map, printed weeks rather than years before. Its grid squares matched to the guns that would soon be firing in its support. Neither man could have told you in that moment how the battle would end. But one of them was reading the ground as it actually was, and the other was reading the ground as it used to be. In a campaign decided by narrow roads, blown bridges and hours lost to confusion in dark forests, that difference proved to be worth more than many of the tanks that rolled forward that December morning. It was, in the end, not unfair so much as earned. The second part of the system was the printing and reproduction capacity that sat close behind the front line. Rather than relying solely on maps produced at depots far to the rear, the U.S. Army pushed lithographic printing units, known as topographic companies, forward into the theater itself, allowing new editions of map sheets to be drafted, printed, and issued to divisions within days of new photographic intelligence arriving, rather than the weeks or months such a cycle might have taken in a more centralized system. A revision that reflected a blown bridge, a newly cut logging track, or a flooded stream crossing could reach the hands of an infantry battalion S2 officer while the information was still tactically relevant. The maps themselves, printed at scales such as 1 to 25,000 for detailed tactical use, were built on a coordinate grid system that allowed artillery observers, infantry commanders, and aircraft to communicate location with an unambiguous precision measured in tens of meters, a considerable advantage when calling for supporting fire in broken, forested terrain where visual landmarks were scarce and easily confused. The third part, less visible but equally important, was coordination. American mapping in the European theater drew on cooperation with British survey organizations, on captured German and Belgian civilian survey material where it proved reliable, and on a standing program of terrain analysis that had begun studying the Ardennes as a possible battleground well before the Germans chose to attack there, in part because American planners had themselves considered the region's suitability, or unsuitability, for offensive operations of their own. What this meant in practice was a difference not simply in accuracy, but in currency. A German staff officer working from a 1938 civilian road map annotated with 1940 campaign notes was, in effect, fighting the terrain as it had been rather than as it was. An American officer working from a map sheet revised within the previous month was fighting the terrain as it actually stood in December 1944, mud, blown culverts, felled trees, and all. To put the scale of the American effort in perspective, engineer topographic units in the European theater were, by late 1944, producing and distributing millions of individual map sheets to combat formations, an industrial process closer to a newspaper's daily print run than to the individual draftsman's work that characterized much German cartography of the period. The comparison is not one of national ingenuity so much as one of infrastructure, priority, and the sheer weight of resource that American logistics could bring to bear on a problem that, for the Wehrmacht by the winter of 1944, competed for attention against fuel shortages, ammunition shortages, and the increasingly desperate arithmetic of a two-front war. If you are finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing. The consequences of this gap became visible almost immediately once the offensive began. German planners had allotted tight schedules for their armored spearheads to cross the Ardennes and reach the Meuse, timetables that assumed roads and bridges would bear the traffic loads the maps implied. In several sectors, those assumptions collapsed within hours. Narrow forest roads, marked on German maps as adequate routes for armored columns, proved barely passable for wheeled transport once mixed with tracked vehicles, retreating civilian traffic, and the churn of winter weather. Bridge failures and unexpectedly weak crossings forced repeated diversions, and those diversions, multiplied across dozens of routes and several corps, produced the traffic congestion that historians of the battle have long identified as one of the offensive's chief self-inflicted wounds, particularly in the sectors assigned to Sixth Panzer Army in the north, where the road network proved even less generous than planners had hoped. American and British units, by contrast, were frequently able to identify, in near real time, which routes remained viable and which had been cut, allowing formations such as those defending the Elsenborn Ridge or holding the shoulders of the German penetration to redeploy along routes their own commanders could trust with reasonable confidence. This is not to say American maps were flawless, nor that terrain intelligence alone explains the battle's outcome. Weather, logistics, fuel, and the extraordinary resilience of individual American units at places such as Bastogne and St. Vith all played their part, and any account that reduces the Battle of the Bulge to a contest of paper would be doing a disservice to the men who fought it in the snow. But where terrain uncertainty compounded German difficulties at almost every turn, it rarely did the same to their opponents. It is the early hours of December 16, 1944, and in a command post somewhere behind the German lines in the Eifel, an officer of Fifth Panzer Army unrolls a map across a folding table lit by a single shaded lamp. The paper is old. In places, it is a reprint of a reprint, its contour lines traced from surveys carried out before the First World War, its forest tracks marked with the confidence that the forest itself will not honor. Outside, in the freezing dark, columns of armor and infantry are already beginning to move west into the Ardennes, following roads that on this map look wide and metalled and reliable. Many of those roads no longer exist in that form. Some never did. A few hundred kilometers away, in a tent lit by hooded bulbs somewhere behind the American front, an engineered topographic unit is doing something almost mundane by comparison, checking grid references against aerial photography taken within the past fortnight, updating a map sheet that will be in the hands of a rifle company commander within days. Two armies are about to fight for the same patch of Belgian and Luxembourgish forest, and one of them understands that forest considerably better than the other does. This is the story of why that gap mattered, how it was built, and why, decades later, German officers who survived the battle would still describe American mapping of the Ardennes with something close to resentment. It is not a story about tanks or guns. It is a story about paper, and about how paper can decide the outcome of a battle before a single shot is fired. The problem the Wehrmacht faced in December 1944 was not a shortage of maps. Germany had, in fact, an old and in many ways distinguished tradition of military cartography, stretching back through the Prussian General Staff's survey establishments of the 19th century. The difficulty was that by the winter of 1944, much of what German planning staffs had on hand for the Ardennes region was exactly that: old. Large parts of the base survey data for the area dated to before 1914, updated in patches during the interwar years and again during the 1940 campaign, but never comprehensively resurveyed to the standard the German army itself would have preferred. Compounding this was the sheer speed with which the Ardennes offensive, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, was planned. Hitler's directive for the operation came in the autumn of 1944, and the staff work that followed was compressed into a matter of weeks, conducted under strict secrecy that limited how widely intelligence requests could circulate without risking the security of the plan. German aerial reconnaissance capability by this stage of the war was a shadow of what it had been in 1940. Allied air superiority over Western Europe meant that German reconnaissance aircraft could rarely overfly the battle area at will, and the Luftwaffe's photographic reconnaissance squadrons were both depleted in aircraft and starved of fuel. The result was that the officers planning one of Germany's last great offensives were working, in critical respects, from a picture of the terrain that was years out of date, stitched together from pre-war Belgian civilian survey sheets, captured French material, and whatever fragments of more recent reconnaissance could be gathered in the time available. Bridge capacities were estimated rather than confirmed. Road surfaces were assumed rather than verified. The map told the planners that a route existed. It could not always tell them whether that route could bear the weight of a Tiger tank in December mud, or whether a bridge marked in black ink was still standing at all. The American solution to this same problem had been built quite deliberately over the preceding 2 years, and it rested on an infrastructure that the Wehrmacht simply did not possess in comparable form by late 1944. At the center of it sat the United States Army's Corps of Engineers, and within that, specialized topographic battalions whose entire function was the rapid production, revision, and distribution of accurate terrain intelligence to combat formations. This was not a single clever invention, but a system, built from several interlocking parts. The first was photographic. Allied air forces, and in particular photographic reconnaissance squadrons flying modified Spitfires and Mosquitoes, maintained something close to continuous coverage of the ground over which Allied forces were fighting or expected to fight, weather permitting. These aircraft, flying at altitudes and on flight lines designed for stereoscopic overlap, produced photographic strips that Army topographic units could examine in 3 dimensions using stereoscopes little larger than a pair of binoculars mounted on a small frame. Viewed this way, a flat photograph of the Ardennes forest suddenly revealed itself as a landscape of ridgelines, defiles, and stream valleys with a precision no ground survey party could have matched in the same span of time.